afternoon and very, very warm welcome. It's sort of my tradition to welcome you on a sunny May afternoon, but maybe that's a part of tradition which we have to break. But it's bearable. I think we can manage. I'm delighted to see you here. I'm Maria Yashor, the director of the International Gender Studies Center, IGS at Lady Margaret Hall. And we're so delighted and honored that Professor Mona Siddiqui was able to accept our invitation to give this year's commemorative lecture. And before giving you a brief introduction to the lecture, the speaker, the lecture series, let me just briefly tell you what's happening this afternoon. Following the lecture, we will have a question and answer session presided over by Professor Teresa Morgan, who's just managed to arrive in good time. Teresa, Professor of Greek Roman History, tutor in ancient history at Oriel College, and importantly also a member of the IGS Advisory Council. And Teresa will be chairing the question and answer session. And following that, and concluding this afternoon's event, we will have a small reception in the adjacent Monson Room, and we very much hope you're able to join us for that. Well, today, extraordinarily so, this will be the 32nd lecture in the series of Annual Commemorative Lectures. An institution that was set up by the founders of this center 32 years ago. It's been going strong ever since. It was set up to give recognition, to remind us of the debt we are owing the early pioneers in an enduring metro line of anthropological research of women in diverse cultures. These pioneers are the anthropologists Audrey Richards, Phyllis Cabery, and Barbara E. Ward, whose life and work we are honoring today. Now, over these many years, we've had the great honor of hearing women who combine exceptional scholarship with committed feminist activism, and who are passionate about making a difference, and doing so in a way that has always enriched our vision, or at the same time that it has troubled our understanding of this very complex world in which we live. And it is thus that we were so glad that Professor Siddiqui accepted our invitation for this year. Now, many present here will be familiar with Professor Siddiqui's scholarly work and public engagement. But allow me just to provide you a bare outline of what is such extraordinary and multifaceted, varied life and career, for the benefit of those who might appreciate a reminder. Professor Siddiqui holds a chair in Islamic and Interreligious Studies at the University of Edinburgh's Divinity School, the first person to do so, specializing in Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations. She also holds the post of Assistant Principal for Religion and Society and Dean International for the Middle East. She's held visiting professorships in several Dutch-American universities, including a Humanitas Professorship at Cambridge. Thus, unsurprisingly, the academic public honors bestowed upon Professor Siddiqui are numerous, an intimation of the scope of her work and influence within and outside academia. As regards areas of work and research, as already indicated, these are primarily in the field of fiqh, of the classical Islamic jurisprudence and ethic, and the theological history of Christian-Muslim relations. The research output is an impressive indication of the scope of her scholarship, both in Islamic and Christian theology. But it is not only in scope, it is also in her readiness to confront and challenge difficult and sensitive issues that Professor Siddiqui reveals herself as someone, to use Ursula King's words, someone who dares to go where others fear to tread, applying her erudition and profound knowledge of Islam and interreligious themes to often highly contentious areas of interpretation, and is doing so from an unambiguous and unapologetic faith possession. And here in this connection, I can only recommend a fascinating autobiography, My Way, A Muslim Woman's Journey, which I've read with great deal of delight. Publications, monographs, articles are simply too numerous to list. So I just want to confine myself to very selected few recent publications, which commanded considerable attention, critical acclaim. There is, first of all, Hospitality in Islam, welcoming in God's name, which focuses on the core precept of hospitality. It's a relational triangle that links God, the guest, and the host. A concept that featured only yesterday morning in Mona's Thought for the Day, a very regular contributor to the Radio 4 program. About this book, Khaled Abu Al-Fadl says, quote, "This study pioneers a critical conversation between religious traditions on a fundamental human concept, hospitality, in an age where the world community is confronting so many problems, from displaced people and refugees to victims of human trafficking and dispossession." The other publication, The Good Muslim, Reflections on Classical Islamic Law and Theology, published by Cambridge University Press, reflects key themes in Islamic law and theology, exploring, among other areas, friendship, divorce, drunkenness, slavery, love, and revealing how Islamic ethics plays itself out in institutional but also in the most intimate spheres of life. And then the publication of deserved acclaim, Christians, Muslim, and Jesus, published by Yale University Press. As it happens, we have in our midst a reviewer of this last publication, Professor Ursula King, Professor Emerita of Theology and Religious Studies at Bristol. Professor King, in a review which appeared in Times Higher Education, if I may quote, says this: "For a Muslim writer to seek new forms of dialogue between Christians and Muslims is an audacious venture. Mona Siddiqui has dared to go where others fear to tread. Only recently, an eminent Vatican representative still took the view that there can be no theological dialogue with Islam. Yet it is precisely such theological dialogue that Siddiqui wishes to encourage. She does so with admirable empathy and detailed knowledge of Islamic and Christian theological texts, offering an exemplary model of how courageously creative dialogues might be constructed, and a new model of interfaith relations advanced." Who can better those words? Not only is Professor Siddiqui well known internationally, also as a public speaker on issues around religion, ethics, and public life, she's engaged in many other ways, and not always, I think, most terribly interesting and sexy ways, sitting on so many committees and boards. For example, BBC's Religious Advisory Committee in Scotland. She's an elected member of the NAFED Council of Bioethics, a member of the Franco-British Council, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. She holds 4 honorary doctorates and honorary fellowship of the Royal Society of Scottish Architects for her contribution to public life. In 2011, she was awarded an OBE for her contribution to interfaith dialogue. And in 2015, Professor Siddiqui was named the Debrett's top 500 list of the most influential people in the UK. Now, I may not have provided the full measure of our speaker and her influence in academic and public life, and of her most personal engagement in matters that concern us all, but I think the lecture will speak for itself. So It is time to invite Professor Siddiqui to deliver this much anticipated lecture. And please join me in welcoming Professor Humanitas Siddiqui to deliver a lecture on veiled voices and the struggle for God.
So, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Maria, for your invitation and for a very warm and rather humbling introduction. So, the title of this lecture, Veiled Voices in the Struggle for God, is going to really be looking at a series of theoretical texts about the feminist struggle. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, so it's really looking at how people have tried to make sense in the theoretical framework of what's happening. In his famous letters to a young poet, Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that the great renewal of the world will perhaps consist in man and woman, freed of all sense of error and disappointment, seeking one another out, not as opposites, but as brothers and sisters and neighbours, and they will join together as human beings to share the heavy weight of sexuality that is laid upon them, with simplicity, gravity, and patience. Decades later, the Moroccan anthropologist, who sadly died a few months ago, Fatima Mernissi, wrote about the female in Muslim societies. And she wrote, "The fear of the feminine represents the fear from within, the debate about globalization, the threat from without. And both discourses will necessarily be focused on women. The cultural and psychological struggles about relations between men and women manifests itself with some difference, but it seems to me with alarming similarity all over the world." So what I'd like to present in this lecture is that amidst the multiple theoretical frameworks which have stretched our imagination, hospitality is something which regulates relations between inside and outside, between private and public, between God and humanity. It's a concept which can also speak to the sexual and intellectual divide between male and female. It is claimed that medieval Sufi literature reflects how women broke barriers and achieved the highest rank of sainthood, but the spiritual life didn't distinguish between male and female. I argue that both in the pre-modern and modern discourses of justice and equality, with all their ambivalence and problematic notions of gender, the female struggle for God has always aspired to something beyond the earthly struggle for rights. So this paper isn't looking at the works of human rights activists, NGOs, or women working simply to improve the lives of other women. I focus more on theory with an array of Muslim and feminist, Western feminist discourse. And then, in the latter part of the lecture, we'll look at women mystics as having a distinct voice in this struggle. If the Quranic discourse on right belief emphasizes the emerging gulf between the believer, believing community, and God, the second divide in the Quran is set between men and women, expressed in the language of limitations and intimacies. These are set against the overarching narratives of justice and mercy, the two defining attributes of God, and which repeatedly emerge as the basis for our moral thinking towards one another. Righteousness knows no gender boundaries in the Quran, as it keeps saying, "And for those who lead a righteous life, male or female, while believing, they enter paradise without the slightest injustice." In so doing, the various themes in the Quran appear far less concerned in defining men and women in terms of the socially constructed gender traits of masculinity and femininity, or binary expressions of sexual difference. In fact, the Quran seldom speaks of women as a collective. It's a text far more concerned with the moral dimensions of people's relationships to one another, because people's relationships to one another reflects their relationship to God. Here, gender and sexuality are present, but only in relational form, always partners in some way, husband and wife, mother and father, and to some extent, master and slave. It is these relationships which fuse society and which form the audience of the Quran. Men and women are physically and emotionally connected to one another in all kinds of ways, and language, sex, and sexuality are essential to this connection. O mankind, keep your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single soul, and from it created its mate, and spread from these many men and women. The primal couple, Adam and Eve, begin their lives in paradise amidst this new physical creation, but their relational, spiritual, and moral lives are fulfilled only on earth, because humankind was always destined for earth. In the secondary literature, the Tales of the Prophets, there is a rather beautiful story of Eve, who is known as Hawa in the Islamic tradition, but not actually in the Quran, whom God first calls his own handmaiden, but whom he gives to Adam at Adam's request, as long as Adam will take her in trust and persevere in thanks for her. Adam has seen Eve in a dream where she is kind to him, and she requests that Adam ask God for her hand in marriage. On waking from this dream, Adam asks God for whom God has created Eve. And God's reply is, "This is my handmaiden, and you are my servant. O Adam, I have not created anyone nobler in my sight than you two, for you have obeyed and worshipped me. I have created for you an abode and called it paradise." This conversation continues with God's creation of Eve as a companion to Adam, so that Adam is not alone in paradise. Adam asks God to marry Eve to him, and the reply is, "I will marry you to her on one condition, that you teach her the precepts of my religion and be thankful to her." And Adam accepted. On one level, this conversation serves as a poignant reminder of God's welcoming of Adam as the first of his human creation, the gift of Eve as a companion, and the relationship of their marriage as a blessing. But in commentaries in the medieval period, Eve is created from a male Adam, and thus womankind desires and needs man, while man is created from the soil of the earth, and so he finds blessings in earth itself. We find here a particular understanding of woman and her creation in relationship to the first man and first prophet. But this reading of the creation story, while fairly popular and dominant in Islamic piety, has been challenged in recent years by various intra-textual feminist readings, which have dismissed this understanding as non-Quranic and therefore contrary to the Quranic egalitarian vision between man and woman. In assessing Quran 4.1, Rifat Hassan argues that the word soul in "from a single soul" is conceptually neither male nor female, even though grammatically it is feminine. There is no linguistic justification to attribute maleness to soul, and therefore for assuming that this original soul is that of Adam's. Rifat Hassan points out that the word Adam in the Quran functions generally as a collective noun, referring to the human rather than to a male human being. Furthermore, she states that the Quran does not say Adam was the first human being, nor that he was a man. The term Adam is a masculine noun, but linguistic gender is not sex. If Adam is not necessarily a man, then Adam's partner is not necessarily a woman. Her linguistic analysis of the term zawj, or partner or wife, in the Quran, primarily meaning mate, leads her to conclude that the reason why the Quran leaves the terms Adam and partner deliberately unclear, not only as regards sex, but also as regards number, is because, and this is her quote, its purpose is not to narrate certain events in the life of a man and a woman, but to refer to some life experiences of all human beings, men and women together. For some, the word Adam is used and retained more as a concept than as a name of a concrete human individual. Hassan points out that Adam is used more selectively to refer to human beings only when they become representative of the self-conscious and morally autonomous humanity. Amina Wadood also states that soul, or nafs, is conceptually neither masculine nor feminine. She adds that in the Quranic accounts of creation, the origins of the human race do not begin with Adam, the man, and concludes rather dramatically. This omission is important because the Quranic version of the creation of humankind is not expressed in gender terms. For the Sufi Ibn Arabi, the relationship between Adam and Eve was governed by a mutual and perpetual attraction to unite, because both are reflections of the one creator. Eve is a hidden aspect of Adam, through which he knows himself, while Adam is the outward aspect of the absolute, through which the absolute knows itself. Despite this alternative view of Adam and Eve, it would be reasonable to say that Islamic thought, for the most part, has not burdened the story of the primal couple with as many complex readings as Christian theology. Adam's slip and expulsion from paradise may well be the turning point in human destiny, but Adam's disobedience, which leads to mutual sexual awareness, is forgiven, because Adam, A, was always destined for earth, but also because Adam becomes immediately aware of what he has done and repents. Repentance stops any further consequences, and life resumes, albeit changed. A marriage finds its place in fulfillment and regulation of this now unleashed sexual desire. There is an absence of struggle, as in the history of Christian thought, as to whether it was lust or disobedience which precipitated the fall. One act of eating holds both life and death. While Augustine's mythologizing of original sin arose after and amidst other versions or visions of greater humanity, especially in Eastern Christianity, it posed a searing charge. As Jean Hagstrom writes, it presented an unrelenting, its fatality created sexual self-consciousness, inhibition and guilt. Its seeding of willfulness deeply and inescapably within us has led to religious repression, and even the use of holy force, cruel deity. It has led a heavy repressing hand on almost 2 millennia of Christian thought and practice. Tina Beattie comments on this and assesses the role of dialogue in Genesis, in that before the fall, language functions as a medium of creation, command, naming and celebration. Creation insofar as God's word creates the world. Command in God's instructions to Adam, naming in Adam's naming of the animals, and celebration in Adam's recognition of Eve. But she says, in the fall, language becomes instead the medium of debate, objectification, and blame. So we have no access to a state of bliss or innocence which has not been filtered through the linguistic values of the social order associated with repression and concealment. For some writers, the fall of man should be called the fall of woman, because once more, it's the second sex who is blamed for all of the trouble in the world. It is this myth which gave rise to male hatred of women, some have argued, but also self-hatred inward on the part of women. The myth of feminine evil has dominated human consciousness and provides a context for women's victimization by both men and women. This above analysis of both Hassan and Wadud, with an interjection by Tina Beattie, serves as an example of rereading the creation story. Feminist interpreters of the Quran reflect a larger paradigm of feminist scholarship, which wrestles with various exegetical hurdles. Aisha Hidayatullah gives an account of how contemporary feminist exegetes are more concerned with advocating a more holistic treatment of the Quran and a dynamic open-endedness of interpretation. And she summarizes, they have argued that the Quran should be understood as a text revealed in the terms of its immediate 7th century Arabian audience, but also as a universally meaningful text for all its audiences. They have prioritized the Quran's general principles over its particular statements. They have also resisted sexist and violent meanings of the Quran by insisting that its verses must be read in line with the Quran's larger message of justice, harmony, and equality. It's worth emphasizing that the struggle for recognition, justice, and respect, all the kind of words that we use now when we're talking about in the feminist context, as well as that most elusive word, and I think it's more of an ideal, equality, is a modern discourse. And the classical traditions of most religions, including Islam, while trying to give and protect certain rights for women, were not really concerned with rights and equalities in the way we are concerned with these issues today. And this poses a problem for feminist readings of the past, which often appear methodologically anachronistic. In discussing the past in terms of contemporary points of reference, such as gender equality or patriarchy, we may be limited in what we can recover from the past. in terms of marginalised liberatory gender models to create new visions and models for gender equality. But the value of doing feminist analysis of the use of the past, as Gross puts it, is to see that the assessment of history as androcentric in its thought form and patriarchal in its institution is an analysis, an accurate description, not an accusation. Against this background, there has been some criticism of the feminist exegetical enterprise and the whole hermeneutical enterprise. For Nasser Abu Zaid, another significant scholar in the Islamic world who died recently, Muslims had to be freed from the need to recontextualize one or more passages in the fight against literalism and fundamentalism, or against a specific historical practice that seems inappropriate for our modern contexts. He argues, feminist hermeneutics faces a problem that as long as the Quran is dealt with only as a text, implying a concept of author, that is God as divine author, one is forced to find a focal point of gravity to which all variations should be linked. This automatically implies that the Quran is always at the mercy of the ideology of its interpreter. For a communist, the Quran would reveal communism. For a fundamentalist, it would be a highly fundamentalist text. And for a feminist, it would be a feminist text, and so on. In the same vein, Raja Rumi critiques the modern project of retrieval, of uncovering some hidden gender equality as a norm by Muslim feminists. Rumi's concern is that as long as the Quran is seen as a repository of truths from which you can always find some kind of egalitarian Islam, feminist exegesis will continue to explain away difficult verses on the basis of historical contingency, while others of a more progressive nature will be accepted as part of the Quranic egalitarian world. She writes, I do not agree with this methodology that chooses to give a more progressive or egalitarian meaning to a verse and presenting it as a truth when it has the means to do so, while resorting to the idea that such and such verse needs to be contextualized in order to discover its contingency, but it reaches a semantic dead end. In her analysis of such criticisms against women, feminist and largely Muslim exegetes, Asma Berlaz repudiates the patriarchal imaginary of God as father and argues against patriarchy as divinely sanctioned. And she writes, naturally, I am hyper-aware of the few words and lines in the text that speak to male authority, but I view these as reflecting the fact that the Quran's first audience was a 7th century tribal Arab patriarchy in which men did exercise certain types of authority. For the Quran to have dealt with this reality is not to say that it therefore advocates patriarchal norms, since that was a historical condition in which it was revealed. Dealing with a historical contingency is not the same as upholding it as a norm. And she asks the question, why would a God who is above sex and gender and who promises not to transgress against the rights of others, as the Quran teaches, fall prey to shoddy sexual partisanship or hatred by privileging men over women or advocating the oppression of women? Indeed, not only does the Quran not oppress women, this is again Asma Berlaz, but it also affirms that men and women originated in the same self, have the same capacity for moral choice and personality, and as God's representatives on earth, they have a mutual duty to enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. In much of Islamic modern exegesis, there is a recognition that the Quran itself, like most scriptures, does not speak of male-female relations according to contemporary aspirations and paradigms of rights, but it continues to speak of mutual recognition in various forms. And one example is that of marriage, in which husband and wife are seen as garments for one another. The implication here is one of mutual dignity, but also protection. Garments cover, beautify, but they also signify closeness to flesh. They can both reveal and conceal, hide and allure, and sexuality is always present in this image. But in a religion where clothing has for many retained a central place in defining the ideal image of Muslim piety and modesty, the concept of a husband and wife being garments for one another is a potent and demanding depiction of complementarity. And I'd just like to take a little detour here to talk about Fatima Mernissy's one of her work and how she dealt with this issue of patriarchy and female autonomy. Fatima Mernissy makes a witty comment in taking up the debates of how attitudes to clothing reflect both the Western man and the Muslim man's appreciation or degradation of a woman's beauty according to what she wears. In relation to how men in different cultures understand a woman's beauty and intelligence, Mernissy takes the iconic figure of Scheherazade from the classic 1001 Nights. In another one of her famous works, Scheherazade Goes West. I don't know whether anyone has seen that book. It's a tiny little book, but it's definitely worth a read. Menissy's argument is that it's patriarchal control which determines how beauty is imagined and preserved. In a conversation with her friend Jacques, who is an art historian and is showing her the museums and art galleries of Paris, and who she insists, and he's talking to her and showing her all these pictures, and he says to her, and she's going through all of them, and Jacques insists that the women in his harem must be nude and silent, because that is a perfect woman. And she replies, Muslim men seem to get a virile power from veiling women and harassing them in the streets if they aren't covered properly, while Western men like yourself seem to derive a tremendous pleasure from unveiling them. Clothing in the Quran is a metaphor for human fulfillment in one another. This is not about a gendered hierarchy, but points to the cultivation of an attitude of recognition and embrace. The Quran rarely speaks of human emotions, but when it does, for the most part, it doesn't do so in any abstract or philosophical sense, but usually in the framework of mutual relationships, whether they are familial, marital, or commercial. Even in worship, obligatory or voluntary, the Quran speaks less of individual worship, but for the most part conveys this message to people in relational settings. There is an intrinsic good in cultivating human relationships. Human relations mentioned in the Quran contain often a moral and often quite quasi-legal dimension, which involves a constant weighing up of rights and responsibilities. Here the language is of recognition, mutuality and compassion, so in some ways hospitality is always present. And at a fundamental level, I think, when people engage in this kind of hospitality of relationships, they are engaging in a relationship which involves bringing the other into the territory of the self for a period of time, but with no certainties of what may be the emotional and psychological transformation. Women in the relationship of language to female subjectivity, which I'm sure many of you know here, has been conceptualized in various ways. But Lacanian theory, though much criticized, is central to this construction, especially in French feminist thought. For Freud and Lacan, society and religious structures in the West are patriarchal. The masculinist symbolic of the West, by which is meant all of language, as well as non-linguistic forms such as music, art and ritual, the discourses of law, science, economics, and of course religion, is undergirded by the concept of God as divine father. Putting it simply, women are always defined by the masculine and the language of the masculine. So how do women achieve subjectivity as women, where they are not linguistically marginalized, rendered inactive or mute in speech, as well as social significance? There are so many Western feminist writers I could mention here, such as Cizou, Goethe, and Schuzler Fiorenza, but I'll mention one. In her essay Divine Women, the French cultural theorist Figueres writes that the spiritual task of our age is to pursue human becoming to its divine fulfillment, where religion is fundamental to the transformation of the individual. She writes that the divine is essential to subjectivity. Divinity, and by that she doesn't necessarily mean God. Divinity is what we need to become free, autonomous, and sovereign. No human subjectivity, no human society has ever been established without the help of the divine. There comes a time for destruction, but before destruction is possible, God or the gods must exist. To become fulfilled, we need to have a horizon, a future of our own, thereby fulfilling the wholeness of what we are capable of being. For her, this becoming and fulfillment is not about resubmitting to established truths and dogmas, but to search for the way of a human flourishing still to come. This does not mean making God the property of any one religious community, but thinking in a new way about the spiritual growth of men and women. Both the masculine and the feminine should have their own divine ideals, where the divine is a movement towards realizing new possibilities of awareness and transcendence. And she laments that no one has taught us to love God. We've only ever been taught to love our neighbour. But how can we love our neighbour without loving God? It is love of God which forms incentive for more perfect becoming. God is the horizon for human becoming, and each of us has to take responsibility for our individual becoming as well as that of the other. But in defining the divine as a love for the other, her divine does not necessarily signify that an entity called God exists. Rather, for Irigaray, the divine should be understood as inspiring within us a perfectible way of being, a form of energy that would inspire us to deeply, fully go into ourselves and to live fully our relations to others. This is a question of ethics, where ethics must replace or at least accompany more individualistic morals, since ethics cares about the cultural space, the spiritual place, both contextual and interior, where the other exists as other. Ethics teaches us not only to kill physically, but also spiritually, either ourselves or the person in whom we are in a relation. In modern Islamic thought, very few writers have spoken of the rediscovery of the divine and the sexual in such terms. But Abdul Wahab Bourdiba's writings explore the interface between the contemporary world of either hypersexuality or religious puritanism, which he sees as convenient ways of escaping our responsibilities or masking our failures to one another. He encourages us to emerge from this malaise by rediscovering the sense of sexuality, which is primarily a dialogue, and the sense of faith, which is also a dialogue with God. He writes, "The authentic encounter with the other sex, the search for the secret life of the other enabled me to rediscover the sense of my own existence. It has often been said that it is not sexuality that invents love, but love that invents sexuality. It is not so much the flesh that is liberated as the spirit that is revealed through the flesh. For sexuality properly performed is tantamount to freedom assumed." For Bourdiba, to rediscover the meaning of the sexual is to rediscover the meaning of God, because both love and faith are reinvented and rediscovered in who we are to find ourselves in a tomorrow that remains largely unknown. Going back to Rilke wrote that love is the hardest thing we do in this life. One could argue that this difficulty is no less in love of God. When it comes to God, perhaps the most fertile pre-modern areas for exploring both the feminine and female empowerment is in the context of Sufism. It is through appreciating the nuances in early and medieval literature of Sufism, feminine imagery, and women ascetics, whereby we can detect a relatively more generous depiction, understanding of women and their spiritual and social autonomy. But again, I would emphasize, this is a pre-modern milieu and a pre-modern discussion, so it carries within itself its own narratives, ambivalent and problematic notions of gender. And yet, it's here that we can also discern a different kind of struggle, a struggle to be as close as humanly possible to God, to love God, and to make God the sole focus of one's devotion, rather than any other social struggle for rights. It was Sufism which gave women the chance to achieve the rank of sainthood, where the spiritual life didn't distinguish between male and female. This could be seen as providing an alternative, a more hospitable narrative to women's physical and spiritual status in Islamic societies. And in some cases, Sufi practices have subverted traditional patriarchal religious anthropology in ways that might provide contemporary Muslims with creative resources to expand the paradigm for gender justice in their society. As many have pointed out, in the earliest phase of Sufism, celibacy was favoured by many who believed marriage, family, and other social relationships would distract them from absolute devotion to God alone. So the denial of physical comforts and sleep deprivation in order to pray and recite at night was a common feature of ascetic life. Even those who did marry were wary of excessive sexual indulgence, and there was much debate about what constituted the ideal form of ascetic life, marriage or celibacy. Bearing in mind that there are a couple of verses in the Quran which seem to discourage celibacy, but for Sufis, celibacy was a real issue. Marriage was part of the prophetic sunnah, or prophetic life, and allowed men and women to enjoy illicit sex and not have to quell their desire. Celibacy, however, was a more pure and unburdened life. According to one of its main proponents, the 11th century Sufi Hujwiri, Sufism was founded on celibacy. The introduction of marriage brought about a change. And here it says, there is no flame of lust that cannot be extinguished by strenuous effort, because whatever vice proceeds from yourself, you possess the instrument that will remove it. Another is not necessary for that purpose. The issue of authenticity and authorship within the whole saintly literature of Sufism, or hagiography, throws up two particular tensions. One is that this kind of literature is given to a pious exaggeration of the various lives of the saints. And the second is that at least until the medieval period, we are entirely dependent on the record of male compilers. As Maria Diakaki points out, women did not write their own texts in the earliest periods of Islam, when female Sufis appear to have been particularly abundant and active. But despite these reservations, it's still possible to get a sense, some glimpse, of both the practical differences and similarities between male and female spirituality. Many of the women ascetics also led celibate lives, so as not to be distracted by marital and domestic life. It is said that Hassan al-Abida of Basra refused to marry because there was no man who was detached enough from this world to accompany her in the rejection of worldly things and in her constant prayer and fasting. Another is stories about Rabia bint Ismail, who could not love her husband with marital love, and told him that she prayed constantly because she could not hear the call to prayer without thinking of Judgment Day. There are many accounts of women who engaged in all-night vigils and praying, including Mu'adh bint Adawiyah of Basra, who spent every day prepared to die at any moment. As a result, she would not sleep, but prayed constantly, and in cold weather, she would wear thin clothes rather than warm clothes so as not to fall asleep. Women were also given to self-mortification, including crying till they were almost blind. This was preferable to the torments of hellfire. And blindness was a common motif, as it was felt that physical blindness helped a person see God even better, especially, as was later believed, the eye is no longer a veil between the person looking and the one being looked at. This reminded me a little bit of the 14th century English Christian mystic Julian of Norwich. For Julian, love is God's meaning, and therefore love should be our meaning too. God loves humankind without beginning or end. And Julian was already detached from this world. There was nothing in this world she wanted to live for, except that by passing through it, she might learn to love God better. Julian had prayed brave prayers, first for our near-fatal illness in youth, so that she might endure the trials to which God subjects human beings at the hour of death and come out a better believer. Second, she prayed that she might understand Christ's passion, not only that she might be an eyewitness in the way Mary Magdalene and other God-lovers were, but that she might have the spiritual wound of compassion and be permitted to suffer with him, to feel his pain in her body. Some of these Sufi women, like their male contemporaries, lived independently. They travelled on their own in search of knowledge, and they had both male and female teachers and disciples. It's worth mentioning here that the area of transmitting knowledge or acquiring expertise in the religious sciences many women achieved relatively high status in earlier medieval Islam. Their names are mentioned in biographical collections, and it is recognised that part of their learning required a contact with men. But their learning hardly ever translated into teaching in formal positions in Islamic institutions. Most continued to study and teach in informal frameworks, and by the time of the Ottomans, which saw the high bureaucracy of the scholarly establishment, women seem to have disappeared from the biographical literature. Nevertheless, women Sufis had their own ways of reflecting their faith and worship. As Margaret Smith has shown in her seminal work, and perhaps the most famous of them all, the liberated slave girl, Rabia al-Adawiya, it was Rabia whose writings and singular devotion transformed Sufism into an ecstatic love mysticism. Rabia had no time or interest in anyone other than God, and an example of her exclusive devotion is reflected in her words. "O my Lord, the stars are shining and the eyes of men are closed, and kings have shut their doors, and every lover is alone with his beloved. And here I am, alone with thee." For her, God was the beloved, who so fulfilled her heart that she had room for no other, not even the prophet. She closed her shutters in springtime in case the beauty of the flowers distracted her from the beauty of her beloved. She refused every offer of marriage, preferring to devote herself exclusively to God. And she is the one whose haunting lines immortalized her singular love of God, who wanted to love God for God alone, not out of fear of hell or desire for paradise. "O God, if I worship thee for fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thy own sake, grudge me not your everlasting beauty." In whatever way the mystic imagines nearness to God, there is here a desire for total dependence, the nothingness of my being until completed by him. One popular legend tells us that Rabia ran through the streets of Basra with a bucket of water in one hand and a burning torch in the other. And when asked why, she replied, "I want to pour water into hell and set paradise on fire, so that these two veils disappear, and nobody shall any longer worship God out of fear of hell or hope of heaven, but only for the sake of God." While these devotional attitudes of Sufi men and women were similar in many aspects, the words attributed to early Sufi women suggest that they developed their own image of the divine beloved as both gentle and strong, fierce, jealous, and disarmingly intimate, metaphorically conceptualized as a masculine object of their female longing. So there was a tendency for female Sufis to conceive of God in symbolically masculine terms, and to express this relationship in symbolically gendered ways. It is said that Fatima bint Muthanna, who described herself as Ibn Arabi's spiritual mother, would sometimes play the tambourine and sing the glory of God. "I rejoice in him who has turned toward me and claimed me as one of his friends. Who am I that he should have chosen me amongst all humankind? He is jealous of me if I look to others. He loosens afflictions against me." So for many of these women, God's love for his female devotees was often envisioned as a jealous male love and possessiveness. It was seen as direct and personal rather than the more abstract notion of love jealousy in many male Sufi writings. One of the apparent differences between the reflection of female piety and asceticism was that it was very much seen as an inward journey, both physically and spiritually. It was the kind of asceticism lived and practiced often in the seclusion and privacy of their own home, rather than in the public gaze. As spiritually accomplished women, they were sometimes granted access to public spaces and the opportunity to interact with the prominent male authorities of their time. But they seem to have persistently preferred seclusion and solitude. As again Maria de Carpio notes, these were confident and independent women who did not adopt relatively greater seclusion out of any self-effacing deference as women, but out of a vigilant rejection of worldliness and strong sense of wisdom. Another Sufi woman, Fatima of Nishapur, was a teacher and peer of some of the most prominent mystics of her time. They saw her, this is both men and women, as their teacher, and the famous Bayezid Bistami is reported to have said of her, "In all my life, I have only seen one true man and one true woman. The woman was Fatima of Nishapur. There was no station about which I had told her that she had not already undergone." She wasn't only a spiritual teacher to male Sufis, but was also described by her male disciples as the most excellent amongst all Sufis. To some extent, this reflects a counter-normative gender position within mainstream Sufi discourse that male ascetics recognized and respected the spiritual status of women ascetics. But again, according to the 13th century Sufi poet and biographer Attar, Bayezid described Fatima's spiritual status: "If any man desires to see a true man hidden in women's clothes, let him look at Fatima." Sufi ethics was known as manliness, which comprised both chivalry and courage. It's a word not found in the Arabic language at the beginning of Islam, but it came to mean the ideal, noble, and perfect man whose hospitality and generosity would extend until he had nothing left for himself. It was Sufi manners or adab, or perfect behavior modeled on the Prophet himself, which said that spiritually advanced women were seen to be quintessentially male or becoming male. Masculine descriptions of Sufi women signified that they were considered as equal to the male Sufi masters of their time. And within this androcentric symbolic system, male is not restricted to men, but rather signifies spiritual aspirants, including women. But whatever status of spiritual perfection was given to such women, the language reflected the pervasiveness of patriarchal ideology, where spiritual mastery is fundamentally connected to men. The metaphor of becoming male, used for spiritually enlightened women, is premised on an anthropology that cannot assimilate the category of femaleness into its ideal of human perfection. Thus, the female mystic becomes the honorary man, assuming the gender value of a male. But it would seem that female mystics were less concerned about social hierarchy and more about their love for God, a devotion where earthly struggle was of little importance. I just want to conclude on a couple of reflections. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek's accusation that the feminine remains a repressed secret history of Islam has been met with some criticism today. It is stated that despite the names of exceptional women, unfolding Islamic civilizations have always been far more androcentric, even misogynist in their approach, resulting in the oppression or repression of the feminine voice from the archives. But even though the feminine is never totally erased from the archives of Islam when she's mentioned, it is often in the male imaginary. Women remain the ontologically dependent gender. Islam can retrieve a positive view of the feminine, and there are names of pivotal women in the Quran and the tradition who continue to offer paradigms and inspiration for female spiritual and social self-autonomy. But because the masculine self-same logic that structures the symbolic archives of Islam, the retrieval of the feminine upholds a signifying economy in which the masculine is privileged in all arrangements. An example of how to use the past can be read into the very concept of Abrahamic traditions, the abbreviation for understanding the history of Abraham, the father of the Semites, and of monotheism. In the story of Abraham, Hagar and Sarah play a marginal role in the New Testament, and Hagar isn't even mentioned in the Quran, and Sarah is not mentioned by name. There is an omission here, resulting in these mothers not playing the same roles as Abraham in the various monotheisms. Yet, as has been said, we need to take these female figures seriously today, as without these primal mothers, there would be no Jewish, Christian, or Islamic civilization. Let me conclude by saying a very brief word on the great Sufi philosopher and poet Ibn Arabi, who conceived of the perfect man, the microcosm, or the insan al-kamil, to be once male and female, reflecting the image of the androgynous God figure. The concept of the perfect man does not signify all actual individuals, but rather the ideal or the potential that all humans do in fact possess, which is realised in some and not in others. It represents the ideal ethical self and the exemplary standard for human beings to strive towards. It is ungendered, making equal demands on men and women unattainable. The notion of the feminine had become prominent in some mystical writers, and Ibn Arabi, who himself underwent a change in his attitude from hate to love when he discovered that women were dear to the Prophet. To him, masculinity or femininity is but an accident of human reality. Because God contains the totality of all the meanings of the universe, and indeed is a place where opposites are conjoined, he is both active male and receptive female. So it is insufficient for man to contemplate himself, to understand God. The best and most perfect kind of contemplation of God is in woman. In his famous work, The Bezels of Wisdom, he states that sexual union imitates God's relationship with man, the man yearning for his Lord, who is his origin, as woman yearns for man. Despite the explicit and rather controversial nature of the sexual component of Ibn Arabi's theosophy in this world, the woman becomes the highest object of masculine yearning, the very personification of the divine. Thank you.